We drove through the night and into the next morning. A few hours after the sun came up, my back started to ache from sitting in the same position for so long. I told Carol we should pull over somewhere for a break, grab some gas, and maybe find something to eat before we get back on the road. We drove past a few more exits before ultimately getting off at what claimed to be a lively, touristy town. For the life of me, I can't remember what the actual name of the town was. It was one of those places that you'd expect to be a tourist stop, with signs pointing to attractions and promises of unique shops or local history. But even as we pulled in, I felt something was off. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked like they'd seen better days. A little too worn down for a place supposedly catering to visitors. It's hard to explain the feeling, but it was the kind of place where you could sense something was wrong without actually knowing what. I'm sure everyone kind of knows what I'm talking about, but you ever driven through one of those ghost towns where all the shop signs are still up but everything is clearly abandoned? Yeah, that's what it felt like. Only it was weirder, since things weren't actually abandoned, they just looked that way. It wasn't your typical haunted kind of vibe, but strange enough that it's been on my mind ever since. The first stop was the convenience store. We actually had to drive for a decent while before entering the heart of the town, or whatever you'd call it. We pulled in to stretch and grab some refreshments. The two of us headed inside. It looked pretty normal in there, actually. Carol was looking for a specific drink she wanted, but quickly grew frustrated when she realized they didn't have it. She's a bit of a drama queen, so I indulged her tantrum and agreed to go somewhere else. I still wanted to get my Gatorade though, so I walked up to the counter with it to pay. The cashier was a woman about 30 or 35 if I had to guess. She had dark brown hair and was on the taller side. Again, all very normal. The only reason I remembered her features was because she was wearing suspenders, which I wasn't used to seeing. I paid for my drink and we left. Carol pointed to another convenience store across the street, so we figured we'd give it a shot. When we walked into the second store, I literally felt my stomach drop. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the girl who'd been working at the first place. Same hair, same face, same height, same everything. I froze, staring at her. I could tell I was making her uncomfortable. Eventually, I asked her if she had a twin or a sister or something. She gave me a weird look, almost skeptical, said she didn't have a twin and that she was an only child. She narrowed her eyes and told me that was a strange thing to ask, which I guess it was. I tried to explain myself, but she didn't say anything after that. I felt this weird sense of deja vu and backed out of the store, dragging Carol along with me. Carol was confused, but I explained myself and asked if she noticed the same thing. She said she didn't remember what the other cashier looked like, and that I was probably just tired from driving for so long. I knew what I saw though, and told her I'd prove it. We ran back to the first convenience store, but when we got there, the girl inside looked nothing like who I remembered seeing. She was a completely different person. She was short with light hair and looked middle-aged. There's absolutely no chance anyone could have confused her for the other cashier. She didn't even look like she was in the same age range. It was as if I'd imagined the whole thing. Carol told me to just forget about it and that I was tired, but I insisted that I wasn't imagining things. Eventually, I had no choice but to let it go. I was eager to get out of there, but we needed gas. We pulled into the first gas station we saw, which was void of people. It was completely empty, just our car, the pumps, and a small building at the back where you would pay. We were literally the only car in the entire lot. The two of us walked inside. Carol took her sweet time looking for her drink, but of course, it wasn't there either. I paid, waited for her, and we left. We couldn't have been in there for more than a few seconds. As we walked out, I again felt a weird feeling in my gut. What had not 2 seconds ago been a completely empty gas station was now packed to the brim. The place was overflowing with people. It was the strangest thing. Cars filled every single pump, and there were even some lined up as if we'd wandered into rush hour at the busiest station in the state. All the parking spots in the back lot were full too. To make matters worse, it felt like everyone was eyeing us down as we walked to our car. I don't think I've ever felt more uncomfortable by people staring at me. This time, Carol agreed that something bizarre was going on. I could tell that both of us felt the same eerie suspicion. It was like we'd left reality for a second. When we came back, something had shifted. We decided to say screw it on the food and just find our way back to the highway. I didn't have much of an appetite at that point anyway. Back on the road, we didn't say much for a while. I wasn't scared, but I just had a bad feeling in my gut. I'm not sure how to even explain it. As we got slightly further away, Carol and I talked about how weird that had just been. As we were talking, a car passed us, a Toyota Sienna with a cracked windshield. I remember it distinctly because the windshield had this big spiderweb crack running through it, and the side was scratched up pretty bad. It was kind of hard to miss. Carol made a joke about it, but I can't remember exactly what it was. Just as we were starting to loosen up, everything came crashing down again. About 10 minutes later, the exact same minivan passed us again. We were both 100% sure of it. Again, it was impossible to miss with this massive crack in the windshield. How was that even possible, though? We had been driving in a straight line at a pretty fast clip. There's no way it could have gotten ahead of us. But the odds of passing two different Siennas with identical cracks in the windshield were insanely slim. Carol started saying, "Oh my God," over and over again, and I could tell she was on the verge of a panic attack. She told me to speed up, which I did. I was dying inside, but I had to keep it together as the driver, and for Carol's sake. I wanted nothing more than to get back on the highway and leave that place behind forever. I glanced down at the GPS and saw that an hour had somehow passed since we had left the gas station, which was virtually impossible. I wanted to tell Carol about it, but I didn't know if she could take any more weird stuff. My heart was in my throat, but I just kept driving. Part of me wondered if the GPS was going to start taking us in circles. We finally got back on the highway, and the nightmare ended there. By the time we got home, however many hours later, it felt like we were waking up from some strange, disjointed dream. I'm not kidding. That whole experience still feels like a dream when I think back to it. People usually look at me strangely when I tell them this story. I still can't explain what happened there, and I don't expect any kind of explanation. I've tried doing research online about weird occurrences in places like that, and I've actually found a handful of stories that are similar to mine. The weirdest thing about it was the feeling in my gut that I still have trouble describing. Until that point, I really didn't know what it meant to get a bad vibe from something. It's like every bone in your body is begging you to notice that something's wrong. I never want to get that feeling again.
I fucked up because like Tom Hanks used to do these.
It was a chilly night in early March. This happened a couple years ago now. I had just gotten home from work. I was working late that night, so it was close to midnight by the time I walked through the door. I was beyond exhausted. I wanted nothing more than to crack open a freezing cold beer and throw my feet up on the couch. So that's exactly what I did. Alcohol always tastes better after a hard day's work. I didn't even turn on the TV immediately. I just sat there on the couch with my eyes closed and my feet elevated, trying to ignore the nagging thoughts about how stressful my life was. I remember getting frustrated while flipping through the channels because nothing was catching my eye. After sifting through for another few minutes, I ultimately gave up and opted to enjoy my beer in silence. Like everything else in my life, peace and quiet was apparently too much to ask for, because not 10 seconds later, all the lights in my house simultaneously shut off. You know that slightly fuzzy popping sound that comes a split second before everything shuts off? Yeah, there's nothing I hate more than hearing that noise. For whatever reason, our house had a tendency to lose power every so often. Now that I think about it, it still does. Anyway, my first reaction was to step outside and see if any of the neighboring houses were affected. I stepped outside and shut the door behind me, trying to preserve any heat that I might not be able to get back should I fail to restore the power. It was late, but I remember seeing at least one house on my block with their lights on, which confirmed that my house was the problem. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, knowing that this headache would definitely spoil whatever pleasure I was hoping to salvage from the night. I turned back to go inside, but when I turned the handle on the front door, it wouldn't budge. I froze, confused at first. I tried the handle a few more times, but it was definitely locked. What the hell was going on? I banged on the door and called my wife's name, thinking maybe she had woken up without me realizing. There was no answer. I tried to peer through the glass, but it was still pitch black in there. I ran around to the back. That door was locked too. I started panicking. My wife had a tendency to leave doors unlocked, so it was weird that the back door would be locked in the first place. I ran around to the side of the house to check the breaker, and I froze in my tracks. My hose, which I knew for a fact had been coiled, was laying in the grass just below the breaker box. The realization hit me like a freight train. Someone had cut the power intentionally. Without thinking, I sprinted to the nearest window and desperately looked inside one more time. This time, I was able to make out two flashlights swinging around wildly in the dark, as if two people were rummaging through my house. They were. I knew they were stealing shit. I was infuriated. The nerve of someone to do this while I was literally home. I reached into my pocket to call the police, only to realize that I had left my phone on the couch. After cursing under my breath, I told myself I'd just run to the neighbor's house and borrow his phone. As I started making my way to the nearest house, another, more sinister thought hit me. My wife was still inside. She was probably asleep, vulnerable to whoever was in the house. I couldn't leave her there, even for another minute. I sprinted back to my house and frantically grabbed some loose rocks from the yard. I started chucking them at our bedroom window, hoping to wake her up. After the third rock, she opened the window. Before she had a chance to say anything, I quietly told her what was happening and instructed her to hide in our closet. Her head disappeared immediately. She didn't ask questions. I then sprinted to my neighbor's house and banged on the door. I explained what was going on as quickly as possible, and then I used his phone to call the police. I waited on his porch, praying that my wife would be okay. The police eventually arrived, and I ran out to one of the cars, explaining the situation as best I could. They barged into the house, but by then, it was too late. The back door was wide open, and whoever had broken in was gone, with too many of our valuables to count. My wife was more shaken than I was, and understandably so. What she told me and the police made me angry at myself for not doing a better job at protecting her. To this day, I'll never forgive myself for leaving her in the house with potential murderers. Apparently, mere seconds after I instructed her to hide, she heard someone kick the bedroom door open. The person walked into the room and cocked a gun. He stood there motionlessly for a few seconds, clearly listening for anyone in the room. She said she had never been more terrified in her entire life. I believe the intruders heard me throwing the rocks at the window. The scariest part is that we still live in this house, and we're not planning on moving out anytime soon. Sometimes I think about what could have happened had I not stepped outside for those brief moments. I've always lived in the shadow of my older brother. I'm not bitter about it, but it's just been the truth. He's got a successful business, and I've been trying to replicate that for the better part of 6 years now. I recently moved back in with my parents to try and find some footing. Going back home definitely felt like a step backward, but I didn't have many options. I was staying in the basement to keep out of their way as much as I could. It wasn't too bad down there, it was almost like a mini apartment. The basement had its own little kitchen, bathroom, office, bedroom, and even a TV with my old video games. With all that, I rarely went upstairs. I could pretty much live down there on my own, and it kept me from feeling like a total burden. One night, it was either Friday or Saturday, there was a pretty nasty storm blustering outside. Rain was hammering against the windows, and the wind was strong enough to rattle the whole house. I can't overstate the intensity of it. It was one of the wildest storms I had ever seen at that point. My parents were out of town for the weekend, so I had the place to myself, which was fine by me. I remember it being extra cozy down there that night. I love listening to a raging storm from the comfort of a warm bed, especially when it's late at night. There's something about hunkering down inside during a chaotic storm that really eases my mind. I was about to fall asleep to the soothing pattering of rain when the power suddenly went out. Everything clicked off at once, and I was left in total darkness. I groaned, annoyed at the inconvenience. I figured the storm must have knocked out the power, and for a second I thought about going to check the breaker, but I didn't feel like dealing with it. Not with the storm raging outside. Besides, I was about to go to bed anyway, and I didn't really know where the breaker was to begin with. I figured I'd just wait it out and deal with it in the morning. As I lay there, trying to get comfortable again, I heard something. A loud, unnatural thud against one of the basement windows. It sounded heavy, like something had hit it hard. My first thought was that maybe a branch had come loose in the wind or a tree had fallen, but the sound was sharp and deliberate, not like anything I'd heard before. As lazy as I wanted to be, I couldn't ignore a fallen tree. That was a bit of a step up from a simple power outage. Reluctantly, I got out of bed and grabbed my phone, using the flashlight to make my way over to the window. The basement was pitch black, and the only sounds were the rain pelting the glass and the low rumble of the thunder outside. I remember rubbing fuzzies out of my eyes to try and wake myself up a little bit. I held my phone up to the window, squinting through the glass, and nearly died from my heart stopping right there. There was a man's face pressed up against the window, and he was staring in at me. His eyes were wide, his skin pale and drenched. For a split second, he made direct eye contact with me. As soon as he saw me looking, he moved away from the window. I stumbled back, almost dropping my phone in shock. What the f*** had I just seen? I felt my heart starting to race. I could barely breathe, but I didn't have much time to process it because a few seconds later, I started hearing another sound, the sound of footsteps. I listened closely. The floorboards above my head were creaking gently. There were people in the house. Between what I had just seen and what I was hearing, I was on the verge of losing it. I was home alone and my house was literally getting broken into. On top of everything, one of them knew I was in the basement. I couldn't think clearly with how severe the situation was. Everything was happening so fast, but I had no choice but to act. I quickly checked my phone, ready to call the police. But then I remembered that power outage had knocked out the Wi-Fi, and with no cell service in the basement, I was trapped down there, totally cut off. I knew I couldn't just sit around and wait for these people to do whatever they'd come to do. I tried to calm myself, thinking through my options. I couldn't let those strangers just roam around my house, but I definitely didn't want to confront them head on. I was literally stuck in a lose-lose situation. I decided I'd try to sneak upstairs, skip out the front door quietly, and then call the police once I was outside. I didn't have another choice. Keeping my footsteps as quiet as possible, I made my way up to the basement stairs. I still remember the pure fear of that moment. You never know how your body's going to react to something traumatic until it happens. When I reached the top, I peered around the stairwell. My heart sank because I saw 3 figures with flashlights moving around my pitch black house. I watched them for a few seconds, literally petrified. One of their flashlights panned across their body just long enough for me to make out what one of them was carrying. It was a gun. I froze. Every muscle in my body was tense. I didn't move. I just watched as they murmured to each other in low voices. That's when I heard one of them say something that escalated the situation even further, if that was even possible. In a calm, almost casual voice, one of them said, "Alex is in the basement, go find him." I can't describe the terror I was feeling. How the f*** did he know my name? I backed down the stairs as quietly as I could, trying to keep my breathing steady, but inside, I was losing my shit entirely. I knew I didn't have much time. They were coming for me, and I had no idea what was going to happen once they found me. I looked around frantically, considering potential hiding spots. There wasn't time. I needed to get the hell out of there in the next minute, or I was going to die. The only possible way out was through one of the basement windows, but they were all sealed from the inside. I had no other choice. I grabbed a nearby stool, climbed up one of the window wells, and smashed the glass with my elbow. Shards of glass flew everywhere, but I didn't care. I scrambled through the broken window, pulling myself out into the rain. I felt the cuts all over my body, but I didn't have time to register the pain with the adrenaline and fear coursing through my veins. The downpour soaked me instantly, and I ran through the mud, trying not to slip. Once I was a safe distance from the house, I finally got a signal and called the police. I remember my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. By the time the police searched the house, whoever had been in there was long gone. So much stuff had been stolen, I'm not even going to bother listing everything that was taken. The power outage had been intentional, no surprise there. My parents were livid and threatened to kick me out of the house. I basically had to beg them not to, insisting that there was nothing else I could have done. They eventually calmed down, but I'm still pretty shaken by the whole ordeal. I still have no idea who those people were or how they knew my name. I hate thinking about what might have happened had they found me. I live in a quiet suburban area, but there are a lot of more densely populated towns within driving distance of me. A few months ago, I picked up a night shift security job at a warehouse a few towns over. It was situated in this industrial space that stretched on for miles. The building itself was isolated with rows and rows of tall metal shelves and a couple of big loading docks. The work was easy, routine checks, basic security, making sure everything stayed locked up. It was quiet, usually too quiet, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, and most nights I could finish my shift without much happening. It was a Thursday night and it was pouring out. I was checking my phone every so often for updates on the storm, as I wasn't too keen on having to drive home in those conditions. Luckily, there wasn't much for me to do that night, so I at least had that going for me. The power in the warehouse flickered a few times, but held steady, so I wasn't too worried. About an hour in, the power finally gave out, plunging the whole warehouse into pitch black darkness. I was pissed. I was the only employee there that night, so the responsibility for restoring the power was mine. I had obviously been prepped for a situation like this, but I never thought I'd ever have to actually deal with it. I stepped out of my little security room to begin the process. They had instructed me to unplug some of the massive machines before checking the breakers, so that's what I went to do. My flashlight was the only source of light in the whole place. It was honestly creepy as hell. The silence felt thicker in the dark, and every creak of the building seemed louder without the hum of the lights. My footsteps echoed like 100 times louder too, which was definitely an odd feeling. As I was patrolling one of the aisles, I heard a loud, metallic clattering echoing from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. It startled me, but I brushed it off as the storm rattling the roof or the metal shutters. Still, I decided to check it out, aisle by aisle. When I rounded one corner, I froze. A faint beam of light was moving along the shelves up ahead. It looked just like my own flashlight. It clicked off as quickly as I had seen it, but I had definitely seen it. No one should have been there until the morning, though. I felt my heart start to race. Why the hell would someone else be in here? I debated calling out, but ultimately decided against it. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the light, it was gone. The aisle was empty, just rows of crates and shelves stacked high with inventory. I started freaking out, knowing I wasn't going crazy. I knew what I saw. I had a job to do, though. I debated calling the police, but wasn't sure if what I had seen would be enough. I guessed there was a slight chance I could have imagined it. In hindsight, had the company not equipped me with a taser, I probably would have just called the police right there. As I continued my patrol, a strange smell hit me. A musty, metallic odor, like rusted metal or stagnant water. The smell was coming from one of the loading bays, a darker part of the warehouse where crates were stacked up floor to ceiling. I followed the smell with my flashlight, and that's when I noticed something odd. My beam reflected off the polished concrete floor, revealing two sets of wet footprints leading into one of the storage aisles. In that moment, I wanted to run in the opposite direction and call the police, but I couldn't just yet. If anyone was poking around, it was on me. That was literally my job. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the trail. I kept my flashlight low, not wanting to make it obvious where I was. As I got closer, I started hearing faint whispers, just barely audible, like two people having a conversation a few aisles away. I couldn't make out the words, but something about the tone sounded tense, almost urgent. I clicked off my flashlight and held my breath, trying not to make any noise. I gripped my taser and crept closer to the whispering. As I turned the corner, I raised my flashlight to confront whoever was there, but there was honest to God no one in front of me. The whispering had also stopped, which was pure insanity. I had literally been right in front of me. How the hell had they disappeared so quickly? The whole situation had me rattled. I decided that I wasn't getting paid enough for this, so I decided to just make a beeline for the circuit room and get the power on without worrying about my other tasks. I made it there and started fumbling around with the breakers in the dark. As I was doing that, I heard something scrape across the floor nearby. I swung my flashlight around and spotted the edge of a metal tool lying just a few feet away. A crowbar. It hadn't been there before. This was serious now. Whoever was in there with me had potentially malicious intentions. I yelled out that I was armed, which was kind of a half-bluff considering the taser. I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. My nerves were shot at that point, but I knew my life was more valuable than whatever consequences I'd face for leaving. As I was heading for the door, a loud, metallic crash echoed from the far end of the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of rushing footsteps. I felt a surge of adrenaline and started running toward the noise. I turned the corner, and there they were. Standing in the middle of the aisle were two figures dressed all in black. One of them was holding a crowbar identical to the one I had just walked past. They looked at me for a split second, and then, without warning, started sprinting directly towards me. I didn't think. I just turned and ran. All the confidence I had just mustered up was gone. I could hear their footsteps pounding behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I weaved through the aisles, praying that I'd be able to navigate this place better than they could. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded. I paused, catching my breath, and realized they weren't chasing me anymore. Eventually, I made my way toward the exit door and stepped outside. I immediately called the police and begged them to come as quickly as possible. They actually arrived pretty quickly, which I was thankful for. Of course, those two strangers were long gone by then, but the officers were really helpful, and even helped me get my power back up. My boss was not as sympathetic, though. He gave me shit for running, and I almost lost my job over the whole incident. I still can't get over how strange the whole encounter was. Like, it was clear that those people were messing with me, but they still chased me with a weapon. The worst part is I still work nights in that warehouse, although my boss did start putting at least 2 people on the shift every night. I still don't know what to make of the whole thing. I'm just glad those guys didn't catch up to me. Probably a homeless person who'd snuck in looking for shelter, but I couldn't help but wonder how long they'd been living there and how much they'd seen. My parents were twice as shocked as I was. We've kept the basement door locked ever since, and Cosmo still won't go anywhere near that door. I don't remember every detail of this story since I was only around 7, but my parents have filled in some of the gaps over the years, and there are still bits and pieces that stick out in my memory. So here goes. I'm an only child. Yeah, it kind of sucked growing up by myself, but one of the pros meant that my parents were a lot more involved in my life. They'd really go out of their way to make sure I was thriving, and I look back appreciatively on that. Every year around Halloween, my parents would transform our basement into a haunted house. It wasn't anything fancy, just some old decorations, fake spiderwebs, strobe lights, and a lot of enthusiasm. The whole thing was for a good cause. You had to donate canned food to get in, and my parents would give everything we collected to the local food bank. They even made flyers to pass them around my school and a couple of other elementary schools nearby. The vast majority of people who came were parents of kids in my school, but there were always a handful of parents and kids that we didn't know. My parents actually welcomed that. The more strangers there were, the more food they'd be able to collect, and the greater the likelihood that the haunted house would be a hit. We lived in a pretty big brick house in Haverton, Pennsylvania. A lot of the houses in our neighborhood were fully brick for historical reasons I won't get into. That also meant that most of them were really old too, since it was kind of frowned upon to do any remodeling. Our house was the kind of place that already had a bit of an eerie vibe to it, especially at night with its old creaky floors and dimly lit hallways. Every year, my cousins Jeff, Rick, Chaz, and Eric would come down to help my parents set up and manage the night. Usually, they'd dress up in scary costumes and hide around the basement to jump out and scare my friends. That year, they decided to go all out and wore matching anonymous masks. You know, those kind of creepy white masks with the blank expressions. The haunted house was a big hit that year, as usual. We had a good crowd going by early evening, but my parents told me later that there had been a strange man who showed up before things really got started. He wasn't with any kids, which was odd since the haunted house was mostly for families. He said his wife was planning to bring their daughter later on, but he wanted to drop off some food cans early. My parents didn't recognize him, but they figured it wasn't a big deal. They thanked him, took the cans, and stood there awkwardly before he got the hint and left. As the night went on and more people showed up, the basement got pretty chaotic. I remember trying to keep up with my friends, who were screaming and laughing as we ran through the decorations. At one point, one of my friends came up to me crying, saying someone in an anonymous mask had scared her. I tried to calm her down and told her it was just one of my cousins. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said the person had grabbed her wrist and tried to pull her into a closet. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe she was just being dramatic, but the look on her face told me she was genuinely scared. I went and found my parents and told them what she said. They took it seriously and went down to the basement to check things out. They asked my cousins if they had seen anything strange. Jeff, Rick, and Chaz were all in their positions, and each one of them swore they hadn't done anything like that. But then my parents noticed something else. Eric wasn't at his post. Just then, everyone started to panic. Eric came running down the stairs. He said he'd taken a break to use the bathroom upstairs, and that when he came back, his anonymous mask was gone. He figured one of the other guys had taken it as a joke. That set off alarm bells for my parents, and they immediately shut down the haunted house. They made everyone leave and called the police, who came and searched the house, but of course, nothing turned up. That night, I was still a little shaken up, but I figured it was all over. I fell asleep easily enough, but then I woke up to this tapping sound. It was soft, but noticeable, like someone was repeatedly knocking on my bedroom window. I was too scared to get up, so I just laid there, pulling the covers over my chin, hoping I could just fall asleep. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, and I managed to drift back to sleep. But a few hours later, I was woken up again, this time by a scratching noise. It was more urgent than the knocking had been, like someone was clawing at the window frame. I was terrified, but something inside me snapped, and I threw the covers off and rushed to the window. I yanked open the curtains, and my heart nearly stopped. There, staring back at me, was a person in an anonymous mask, only inches away from the glass. I screamed for my parents. They rushed into the room, and I pointed frantically at the window, but by the time they looked, the person was gone. We called the police once again, and they searched the yard and surrounding area, but they didn't find anyone. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. The property was clear. A few months passed, and things settled down. The haunted house was just a memory by then, and my parents had started to ease up on their extra security measures. Then, one day, I came home from school to find an anonymous mask laying on my bed. It wasn't just any mask. It looked exactly like the ones my cousins had worn that night. But the thing that really freaked me out was the writing. Scrawled across the forehead in black Sharpie was my name. How the hell had that guy even known my name?